What has changed in Iran over the past, let's say, 3 weeks, and why? Trump's deal with Putin and Dmitriev, this deal is called, Zelensky calls it Dmitriev's $12 trillion deal. How does it put pressure on Ukraine? A surprising confession from Budanov, remember him from intelligence, about the timeline for the end of the war, the story about Erdogan, Iran, Israel, Erdogan. Unexpected, right? Which surfaced right now, the strengthening of NATO and why Europe is in a panic about a strong Ukraine after the war. And then we'll move on to domestic politics. Communists in the city halls of American cities. American, not Honduras, yes, and not Mozambique. 3 lengthy speeches by Trump about communism and high-profile theft cases in cities that are, of course, as you might have guessed, run by Democrats. In the end, why all of this combined plays into the hands of the Republicans rather than against them. Let's start with what we discussed a few weeks ago, when it became absolutely clear that it's impossible to reach a long-term agreement with the current Iranian regime. On June 17 in Islamabad, as you know, a memorandum was signed. So, a 60-day truce, the opening of the Hormuz Strait. Iran commits to clearing the mines from the strait, and the U.S. commits to lifting the naval blockade. And, well, although it was clear that this was a bit vague and uncertain, the agreement looked like a step toward possible de-escalation. It didn't even look like a step. But already on June 28, yes, the first serious blow to this truce happened. An Iranian drone attacked a Panamanian tanker carrying Qatari oil. A Qatari citizen was killed, the first confirmed civilian casualty since the truce was established. The United States strikes 10 Iranian targets. Remember, yes, so to speak, not an eye for an eye, but the Americans do an eye, so 10 eyes for an eye, and the Israelis do 1,020. 1,027, remember why? 1,020, 1,027 for one, right? That's how many the Arabs demanded for Sergeant Gill. Yes, to release him, they wanted 1,027 Arabs back. Since then, the price of one Jewish life has been 1,027 Arab lives. Well, in America, it's different, 10 for 1. That is, they made 1 strike, we made 10 strikes. The truce, accordingly, is falling apart at the seams, but formally it's holding because, well, no one has created any mechanism to monitor compliance with it. Well, it's just impossible. They killed him, of course, as all this happened during an unprecedented event. From July 4th to 9th right now, we have 6 days of state funerals for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. February 8th, the very first strike of this war. The funerals are accompanied by huge crowds chanting, "Death to America, death to Israel," and there are direct calls from the stage to kill Trump and Netanyahu. Well, if we killed their leader, then why shouldn't they demand to kill our leader too? We'll try to make sure they don't get to us, right? At the same time, the new spiritual leader is the son of the deceased, Moshtaba Hamli. According to all the information, he was seriously wounded in the same strike that killed his father, right? Allegedly, he is disfigured and, according to some reports, has lost a leg. He hasn't appeared in public once during all 6 days of mourning. This in itself already raises the question of the legitimacy of the new government within Iran itself. It was this week, on July 7th, in the midst of mourning, that Iran, according to Washington, attacked 3 merchant vessels. A vessel in the strait, in the Hormuz Strait. Let's pause and take a step back so we can get a better view of the events unfolding before us, right? A step back. Let's now look at everything that's happening through Iran's eyes. Usually, media analysts don't really like to do this, probably mainly because the channels and publications they work for have their own views on life, so either established or paid for. And they don't want any ideas to be expressed that don't match their views on politics, social issues, religion, and so on. And we, you see, could do the same thing, but we are independent. Nobody pays us. And that's why we can do whatever we want. There are 240 million Shia and 1.7 billion Sunnis in the world. Other branches such as Alawites, Ahmadis, Ibadis, altogether, they make up less than 50 million people. Iran is not only a Shia state, but it's also located in the middle of a sea of Arabs. At the same time, they themselves are Persians, meaning Farsi speakers, who, to put it mildly, don't really like Arabs. And the Arabs feel the same way about them. They have some historical scores to settle with each other. So, the Sunnis, led by Saudi Arabia, dislike the Shiites much more than they dislike the Jews. This goes back to the time of the Iran-Iraq War. Iran began preparing to avoid being destroyed. Aggressive development of defense technologies, going underground, and creating proxies throughout the region. This is a natural response of Iranian Shiites to a potential conflict with the much more numerous Sunnis. In order to mobilize their own population, it was difficult to talk about an inevitable struggle with their so-called brothers in faith, even if they belong to a different branch. That's why a scapegoat was chosen. And as always, who turns out to be the scapegoat? You guessed it, the Jew. Well, in America, they'd call it the boogeyman, Israel. At the same time, the leadership of, Iran understood perfectly well that Israel, was not going to attack Iran. But they were very nervous, because Israel might enter into an agreement, an alliance with the Sunnis, and Israeli technologies would be used in the struggle between, different branches of the same faith in Allah. I'm by no means saying that Iran is a kind, fluffy, sweet, or charming regime. I'm talking about the situation they're in and how they look at things from the inside looking out. From their perspective, terrible things began when Trump arrived. Israel, which possesses amazing military technologies, began signing agreements one after another with Iran's sworn enemies, with the Sunni states. With the peripheral ones. And then preparations began for signing agreements between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That is, Saudi Arabia decided to ignore the so-called stumbling block. The Jews who live on the left bank of the Jordan, and to go for recognition and peace with Israel so that Israel would make some moves there regarding the Arabs living in the Jordan Valley. From Iran's point of view, why does Saudi Arabia establish or want to establish relations with Israel? For one purpose. Which one? From Iran's point of view, to fight against Iran. The Palestinian Brigade. Just so you remember, if you didn't know, during World War II, it wasn't a brigade made up of Arabs. There wasn't a single Arab there. They fought on Hitler's side. It was a brigade made up of Jews living in the territory of Israel, Judea, and Samaria. Within the British Corps, they fought against the Germans, and in addition, they also liberated concentration camps. Frightened, Iran began to act and organize the Hamas attack on Israel. They killed more than 1,000 Jews and took about 300 captive. They knew for sure that Israel would start to retaliate now. And they knew for sure that the Sunnis would not be able to sign a treaty with Israel in this situation. They were also feverishly working and are still working on creating nuclear weapons in order to ensure that their neighbors in America don't attack them. Why? A country with the bomb everyone fears won't be attacked. Ukraine gave it up and was attacked. So, from their view, what's the outcome? As a result of what happened, as a result of their proximity to creating the bomb, the U.S.'s goal coincided with Israel's goal, right? And the attack on Iran began. With the approval and help of those very Sunnis whom Iran fears the most, the spiritual leader of Iran was eliminated. And with him, his family, several members of his family, and also many members of the Iranian leadership, the Iranian government, the military. Yes, the U.S. and Israel were involved. Together with the Saudis, with the Sunni countries, they destroyed the army, the navy, the air defense, and the air force of the country. Iran, played its last two trump cards. One was to block the strait, and the second was to start bombing Israel from Lebanon with the help of Hezbollah. But the Iranian pro-Russian proxies, those who, just 2 years ago, could still cause all sorts of trouble for Israel to a significant extent. But they have already been sufficiently weakened, and Israel has reduced their combat capabilities. Against the backdrop of Iran's success in blocking the strait, America is offering negotiations. So at the same time, they send 2 Jews to Israel for negotiations. chosen out of 350 million people, Kushner and Vitkov. In other words, from Iran's point of view, it was like rubbing that insult in even more. These two people, two Jews, are natural enemies from their point of view, because from the Iranians' perspective, again, they will automatically support Israel. The blockade of the Strait turned out to be so successful that Iran is, so to speak, allowed to trade oil. And American ships, some of the ships with American Marines, start leaving the waters of the Persian Gulf one after another. Besides, the strongest enemy, namely America, has its own Achilles heel. It's called elections in November. And so Iran believes that it can influence the situation so that the U.S. president would be powerless after these elections. In other words, to do to America the same thing, or almost the same thing, that America did to Iran, to effectively incapacitate the head of the American state. So now what happens next? Understanding how important it is for Congress not to let Trump act, from their point of view, Iran's task is to buy time, to promise to do everything possible so that Americans think that something might really happen, then change the situation a little, then a bit more and a bit more, always keeping a piece of cheese or sausage or ham, I don't know, in front of their nose. Always pull it back a little. There you go, we've started. So their job is to make up stories, cry on someone's shoulder, and explain that they have factions, that they're not allowed to do things, that they're the good guys and there are bad guys. And that's why they can't. But in reality, as they say, they act from a single center, from a single decision point, and play good cop and bad cop. It's a familiar game, like in a small police squad. Everyone does it. Right, yes? The good cops are, in our case, civilians, and the bad cops are the guards, officers, and so on. So, at the moment when the negotiations were supposed to move to, let's say, a productive phase, to prevent that from happening, they bomb the oil tankers again, and they show the whole world who is the boss. You went the wrong way and didn't coordinate with us, so we can't allow it. They stay silent and claim we were the ones who bombed, right? Well, we can only guess because, well, their drones are there and so on and so forth. So this absolutely doesn't mean that Iran's left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. This means that in Lebanon, both hands are controlled by the same center. So whether it's the son of the former leader lying in bed or someone else, whether it's one person or a committee, it really doesn't matter to us. What matters is the game. And from my point of view, it's absolutely obvious. If you think about it from their point of view, it's logical. So, now let's get back to our story. Now that we understand what's happening with them, so that we can look at what's happening with us a little differently, right? The U.S. responded immediately to the bombing of oil tankers. The Treasury Department revokes the license. We gave them permission to sell. Now we've revoked it, allowing Iran to sell oil, effective immediately. Well, only sales, meaning for winding down deals that have already started now. And the ships have set off. CENTCOM is also striking Iranian targets, including air defense systems, communications, drone warehouses, and mine-laying devices. On the night of July 7th to 8th, the IRGC responds with missiles and drones in two directions, Kuwait and Bahrain. That's where the American bases are located. They almost hit where they wanted, right? There were no casualties, but the sirens were wailing. There was a combat alert there. On July 8th from Ankara, Trump sums up the situation. The ceasefire is over. Trump says, I think it's all over. I don't want to deal with them anymore. And as they say, that's when he really went off on a tear. So he called the Iranian leadership scum. Sick people. He added, if they had an atomic bomb, they would use it. But he's saying this for his own audience. Look how right I was to hit them before they got an atomic bomb. At the same time, he warns that strikes on power plants and desalination plants haven't been carried out yet. And, well, on the fields and so on. Yes, I don't want to do it, but if I have to, I'll destroy them. Whether it will happen or not, we're not sure yet. And now something that concerns much more money than all of Iran's oil combined. Trump and the Kremlin are discussing it. We already know for sure that they're discussing it. It's not a myth. An economic deal worth almost $12 trillion. And it's directly tied to the fate of Ukraine. That's why Zelensky was nervous about it. Back at the beginning of February, he made a public statement. Ukrainian intelligence showed me documents that are called the Dmitriev package in Kyiv. It was proposed by Russia and the United States. This is economic cooperation. The total amount is 12 trillion. So these are Zelensky's exact words. Intelligence showed me the so-called Dmitriev package, which he presented in the United States. That's about 12 trillion. That's what he told journalists then. We're talking about joint projects in aviation and energy, mining and fossil fuels. Also restoring dollar-denominated payments between countries, which of course Trump will like, but China definitely won't like it. That is about actually returning to normal economic relations. In Moscow and Washington, in case of a settlement on Ukraine, that is back to the status quo. So the U.S. is the most important power in the world, the only pole, the only center. Russia submits to it but has a special status because there's this kind of 12 trillion deal. It's all nonsense, as they say, right? They say the author of the package is Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, the person who has all this time maintained a direct line of communication with the American Special Representative Steve Witkoff, who is handling this, as well as Ukraine and Iran. The Kremlin press secretary, that's Peskov, called these proposals a natural expression of common interests. The White House has never officially confirmed or verified the existence of this package. They are maintaining a conspicuous silence. What does this mean in practice? Moscow directly links any movement on Ukraine not only to territorial and political demands, but also to a large-scale revision of the entire economic architecture of relations between Russia and Washington. That would be truly unprecedented. In fact, because I don't know if it was on such a scale or not, but at one time Bush Jr. proposed this to Putin. At one time Clinton offered something like this to Russia. Obama tried to talk about it. But for some reason Russia is offering this to that terrible, frightening, nightmarish person named Trump. How do you put direct pressure on Ukraine? Very directly. If Washington develops a real economic interest in this package, the American administration develops an inherent incentive to push Kyiv. To what end? To end it. Just stop and that's it. That is, they stopped and that's it. That's it. That's it. Got it? That's it. That's it. Zelensky immediately drew a red line. Any such bilateral agreements between the U.S. and Russia must not violate the Ukrainian constitution. Both Russia and America think so. So rewrite your constitution. That doesn't mean it's the right position. It's just that, well, Russia once said, if you change from a unitary state to something like America, into states and so on, a federal system, then we won't attack you. But Ukraine said that we won't rewrite the Constitution, and Russia attacked them. And America hasn't attacked anyone, but it can say, either change your Constitution or we stop selling you weapons. For example, right? And you don't sell to us, the Europeans do. No. See, they give it to us as a gift. They steal money from their own people and come to us, pay us that money, and with that money, we can stop giving. And what will you do then? Who will you buy from? Russia? Will you buy weapons from Russia to fight Russia, right? Well, it doesn't matter. So, and here's a detail that many media outlets simply overlook. Head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov. Yes, the same Budanov who previously headed military intelligence, the GUR. This week in an extensive interview, I already mentioned this, RBK Ukraine made a statement that is worth quoting in full, as they say. To the direct question, is there a chance to end the war at least this year? He answered, there is a chance. And in the spring, the pace of negotiations was very good. Now we've all entered a phase of escalation. Everyone understands this. To get out of escalation, you usually need maximum escalation. Sounds crazy, right? Yes? No, it's not crazy. So psychologically, the fact that there's escalation now, then de-escalation, then a continuation of dialogue, That's a normal human trait that for some reason seems to work psychologically, or maybe it's just psychology, right? And, well, of course, if all sides are interested in this, right? And if the sides are interested, then it will work. The logic is simple and in its own way cynical. For the sides to sit down at the table, the conflict first has to reach its peak. To the question about territorial concessions, Budanov answered without the slightest ambiguity. Any compromises regarding Ukrainian territories or borders are absolutely impossible. And here the question arises, what did he mean? Does that mean Russia keeps what it has already captured? Or does it mean Russia must be forced out so they leave? Which Ukraine obviously can't do, right? Or give the Russians everything they're asking for and nothing more. So basically, nothing is clear at all. How do people who go into politics learn to talk so fast that nothing they say is clear? There you go. So he was asked another direct question. Is the window of opportunity connected to the November elections? Well, to the U.S. Congress, of course. Yes. So he gave just as demonstratively evasive an answer. And what was that joke about political briefings in the army? How did it go again? Yeah, well, the captain there, is giving a political briefing to the soldiers, and he's already starting to forget words. How nice. I'm starting to forget not just words, but the political briefing itself. One soldier raises his hand and says, "You said last time that Russia would catch up very quickly." So, America in terms of meat and milk production, so when will we finally have meat? And the captain answers, "So," to the soldier Rabinovich. Rabinovich is always the one asking questions, so he gave him a vague answer. He said, "Rabinovich, go to..." Well, that's roughly how Budanov answered. To the question then whether the window of opportunity is connected to the November U.S. congressional elections, he said, "That's one of the factors, but believe me, it's not the main one, although it's quite significant." What did you understand from that? He also replied that regardless of the outcome of the midterm elections, Trump will remain a leading political figure in America. No, he will not. The President of the United States will not remain. So, any domestic political difficulties after November will primarily affect American domestic politics, not Washington's negotiating position on Ukraine. Wow.
Wow.
That's an admission. It's actually quite rare. A person at the very center of Ukrainian power is, for the first time, publicly and directly saying, the active phase of the war could really end this year, and the American elections are part of the overall calculation for all sides, including Kyiv. Against this backdrop, NATO is demonstratively flexing its muscles. According to the Secretary General of the alliance, this year into Ukraine's armed forces, they have invested something around $1 trillion. Yes, $1 trillion, he said, dollars. And the next figure they will be requesting from countries is $1.5 trillion. Wow. There is discussion about moving toward a common goal of 5% of GDP on defense for all alliance members, even though not long ago many countries barely reached 2% and in fact were paying closer to 1%. Trump in Ankara, he didn't miss the chance to remind everyone who achieved this shift. 2 years ago, we were not respected. He means us, America. NATO was laughing at us. Everyone was laughing at us. 2 years ago, it was Biden. Yes, no one is laughing anymore. He's a charmer, Trump. And he added a fundamental point that many critics prefer to ignore. Without his intense personal pressure, NATO countries would never have voluntarily raised their spending even to 2%. Let alone 5%. At the same time, he himself admits, these very countries frankly don't like him. Yes, in my opinion, they hate him intensely, precisely because he demands from them what hasn't been demanded of them for decades. But according to him, even the leaders of the alliance themselves, deep down, understand full well this is being done for their own good, for their own security. Well, I would put it this way. If someone was protecting me and I didn't have to do anything about it, and suddenly they come and say, I won't protect you anymore, you have to build up your muscles, spend money, I wouldn't like them very much. Trump also spoke separately about specific defense contracts that directly result from this new level of spending. Lockheed Martin is creating a world-class Patriot missile enterprise in Europe. Northrop Grumman is promoting the sale of advanced American drone technology. So, several American and European companies are announcing partnerships to produce Army tactical missile systems, as well as new Barracuda missiles specifically for Poland. And here's a story that surfaced precisely during Trump's visit to Ankara and makes us look at all of Erdogan's anti-Israel rhetoric in recent years in a new way. I'll tell you about it in a couple of minutes. So, former spokesperson of Tel Aviv's Ichilov Hospital, Avi Shoshin, spoke about the story on an Israeli channel. He made a statement in Canada that instantly spread all over the world. According to him, about 7 years ago, when the Turkish president was seriously ill, supposedly with cancer, Mossad, with personal approval from Netanyahu, secretly sent an Israeli doctor to Turkey, who saved Erdogan's life. The doctor was from Ichilov. Ichilov is a hospital. I'll give you the name, he said. Saved Erdogan. The doctor was from Israel. Israel saved him, that's what Shoshin said. He emphasized that the doctor acted as a representative of the state of Israel at the request of Mossad, under the direction of the prime minister. He flew there and saved Erdogan's life. There was no official confirmation of this story from Israel, Turkey, or the doctor himself, whose name was never revealed. It is worth noting that earlier reports back in January 2022 did indicate that Professor Itzhak Shapira, who was then the deputy director of the same Ichilov hospital, consulted Erdogan on medical issues, but there was no mention of any secret mission, Mossad operation, or anything like that. Nevertheless, regardless of how accurate this particular version is, the situation itself is symbolic. The man who today publicly calls Israel's actions genocide and has broken off diplomatic relations with them, according to this version, owes his life to an Israeli doctor. Not just to any doctor, but to one who flew in specially from Israel at his request. By the way, this is far from an isolated case. Time and again, it turns out that even those who shout the loudest, destroy the Jews, destroy Israel, when they or their loved ones are in trouble, where do they turn? There. For Israeli specialists for Jewish technologies. This, of course, does nothing to stop anti-Semitism as a phenomenon. In Hitler's Germany, people also often sought treatment from Jewish doctors whose killing they had previously called for in public. Then the people who had been saved would go back out onto the street and take part in the harassment or even the killing of the very same people who had just saved them. Another layer of this picture that Western media rarely say out loud. As soon as the war really starts moving toward an end, a completely different fight will begin over what to do with Ukraine itself next. The European Union and primarily Germany are in a panic over a scenario in which the United States starts investing heavily in rebuilding the Ukrainian economy. That's why they're now trying to allocate 100 million euros to invest quickly, so that as soon as something ends or starts over there, America won't have time to get involved. And Ukraine, with its cheap labor force, vast agricultural resources, and a powerful war-boosted industrial sector, will become a direct industrial competitor to the established, outdated ones. A large part will be contributed, a part of the economy. It will be a major part of the economy of Western Europe. That's exactly why Brussels is doing everything it can to bring Ukraine into the European Union now, while it's as weakened by war and as dependent on external aid as possible, with Brussels dangling a carrot. One carrot is 95 billion. Another carrot is 100 billion. Formally, it looks like Brussels is doing everything it can, but in reality, it sets restrictions on which industries Ukraine will have the right to develop and which ones it won't, leaving it able to operate mainly in those sectors that do not compete with the already existing economies of the European Union. This is, in essence, an attempt to preserve things for years to come. Well, it's basically about making Ukraine dependent on Brussels even before the country gets back on its feet after the war, turning it not into an equal partner, but into a controlled junior player in the European economy. All right, let's move on to America and head towards the end of our long monologues, so to speak. The Republicans got extremely, even indecently lucky, although they themselves are unlikely to ever put it that way. In New York and in a number of other American cities, young people raised on anti-capitalist rhetoric and propaganda in universities have, over the past few months, brought open supporters to power. Well, they call themselves socialists, but they're really Marxists, fascists, communists, you name it. And not just to mayoral positions, but also to legislative committees, assemblies, city councils, and even Congress. Let's take the main symbol of this wave, the mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani. On July 4th, on the 250th anniversary of U.S. independence, standing, or rather he was sitting, at George Washington's historic table, he gave a speech in which he didn't praise the country, but instead essentially said, "We see the richest country in the history of the world, a country where children go to bed hungry." Wow. While the world's first trillionaire craves more, we see monopolies dominating every industry and oligarchs buying elections. Well, that's quite a speech for the 250th anniversary of the country. He called America an arena of supremacy and tied his thesis of American exceptionalism not to the spirit of the country, but to liberal immigration policy. We need to open the gates, let everyone in. So then we'll be that exceptional special country, right? A little earlier, when announcing the city budget, Mamdani said, "We balanced the budget by taxing the rich. And we didn't balance it at the expense of the working people, and we never will." At the same time, in reality, the city received such emergency aid from the state of New York, $5.5 billion, that, by the way, was stolen from ordinary state taxpayers, some of whom also lived in the city. Also including residents of Rochester and Buffalo, who themselves did not choose Mamdani. Moreover, part of this balance was achieved by delaying pension payments. Think about that. They say, "Oh, we balanced it, but how? We postponed the pensions. Postponed them for when? What about now?" We needed balance, but they're just delaying problems instead of fixing them. At that press conference, he used a telling phrase, quoting the libertarian economist Friedrich Hayek, but his words were twisted. Hayek said, "If we must." If socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. These last few months have shown, he said, that socialists understand the economy better than capitalists, which was harmful.
Последние месяцы показали.
We are able to solve the problems of their years-long management failures through our own principles. Let me remind you, their principle is, if you see something, run, grab, take it, hit the pension, hit the face with an axe, do whatever you want. Harmful. Our own principles, let me remind you, their principle is the following. Saw money, we'll figure it out. And even earlier in an interview with CNN, even back then, he did not hide his views. "I have a lot of complaints about capitalism," he said, referring only to Luther King. Call it democratic socialism. Democratic socialism calls for fairer wealth distribution for all of God's children in this country. By the way, he doesn't believe it. And she is the quintessence of what's happening in the Democratic Party right now. These are no longer social democrats in the European sense. These are people who openly and proudly call themselves socialists, well, Marxists, right? They are winning elections in the largest cities of the country and are already making plans for federal expansion. Mamdani personally supported 3 candidates for Congress in the June primaries in New York, and all 3 won. The primaries were within the party. As for us personally, how exactly Republican strategists plan to use these specific quotes, these particular socialist victories in the election campaign this fall, and what does this mean specifically for Russian-speaking voters? In California, in New York, and in other states, who themselves once fled from socialism, I'll tell you in a second. And this is where Trump comes into play. Clearly structured, detailed programs and offensives, but the ideas about socialism are laid out not in 1 but in 3 consecutive speeches. He delivered them over the course of a week. The first major speech was on July 1st, a short but programmatic phrase. As we see now, communism is the greatest threat to our educators. I agree with him. Communism is the greatest threat, we believe. We see now communism is the greatest threat to our country. I agree with him. Communism is the greatest threat to our country. Second, Mount Rushmore. On July 3rd, on the eve of Independence Day, delivered in a national park that is traditionally associated with unifying rather than political rhetoric, communism is a deadly threat to American freedom. This is the greatest threat to our country, greater than World War I, World War II, Pearl Harbor, or even September 11th. He also touched on the topic of newcomers to the country, whose ideas, according to him, are completely opposed to the American way of life, and called on Republicans to abolish the Senate filibuster and pass the Save America Act, a law requiring mandatory proof of citizenship when registering voters. Third, and most important for our topic, this is the final NATO press conference in Ankara on July 8, where notably at least half of the speech was devoted not to Iran or NATO, but specifically to the internal affairs of the United States of America. It should have been the other way around, right? In fact, he also touched on America and said almost nothing else about foreign affairs. He wanted to tell the whole world what was going to happen. There, Trump tied everything together with the most candid thoughts and statements. He said that he became #1 on TikTok. Precisely because, in his own words, all I do is talk about communism. And he added a key phrase which is essentially his campaign strategy, stated verbatim, "My words about how great our country is." How successful our country is and how bad communism is and how bad these lunatics are, and these are not social democrats, that's not it. These are communists who are running. They don't want God at all. They don't want us, our country, to succeed. They don't want our country to be successful. They don't want our people to be well off. The whole three-part program is laid out very methodically, I would say. First, to show the voters what has actually been accomplished in the country in a year and a half of his presidency. A record, according to him, $19.2 trillion in investments. I want to say one thing about this right away. So, Trump says $19.2 trillion based on I don't know what. The budget office says it's $10 trillion and critics say it's even less. But I want to say, gentlemen, because in 4 years under Biden, the country received less than $1 trillion in foreign investments, and in a year and a half under Trump, okay, let's say $5 trillion, right? That's already about 10 times more than what, so to speak, Biden received. So 19.2, 10.4, it doesn't really matter. For me, $1 trillion is just an incomprehensible number. So no matter how many trillions, it's amazing. So here's the thing. New factories are already being built all over the country, from automotive to pharmaceutical, chip factories too, by the way, right? Tariffs, which Trump claims are bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. He's now creating the largest number of jobs in the country's history. Then Trump talks about what we still have to do. He, well, sort of, so to speak, shows, this is what we're offering, and this is what the Democrats are showing. They're socialists. This is what they're calling for. They're calling for something new. They're calling for stealing, robbing from those who have already achieved something. And according to Trump's own wording, communists who, if they come to real federal power, will return to the same deception, theft, and plundering that, in his view, happened during the Biden administration. Well, I said in his view, but we already see a huge number of violations, theft, profiteering, and corruption that have taken place. This picture is completed by a series, high-profile investigations and criminal cases. Cases specifically related to cities and states that have been governed by Democrats for many years. We're also talking about federal investigations involving governors in California, Minnesota, and other states, including one involving Gavin Newsom and a whole series of cases about the misuse of budget funds at the municipal level in different states where the same political party has been in power for years. These are the specific cases that Republican strategists plan to bring up to highlight alongside rhetoric about the communist threat so that the average voter forms not an abstract but a very concrete picture in their mind. This isn't just a bad ideology somewhere out there. It's the concrete theft of real money from real taxpayers, from you and me. And it's done by the very same people who, at the same time, publicly tell voters about the need for a fairer redistribution of wealth. Well, I mean, they want to steal even more from us, from you and me. Despite how complex and alarming this picture is, if you look closely, it actually benefits those who can explain it simply, clearly, and without unnecessary panic. The victory of the communists in certain cities is not the beginning of a new era, but a troubling yet useful lesson that a significant portion of voters will have learned by November. In New York, you can already see the effects of this policy in people's own pocketbooks. History is cyclical. The pendulum has swung sharply to the left, and it will swing back in the other direction. As has happened more than once in American politics. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe, hit the bell with all your might, or gently if you feel like hitting it gently. Let's figure out what happens next together. We'll continue.